When people picture medieval warfare, they usually imagine armored knights crashing together in glorious charges. But Crecy wasn't that kind of battle. On August 26, 1346, an English army led by Edward III found itself in northern France, tired, far from home, and facing a much larger French force under King Philip VI. This was part of the early phase of the Hundred Years' War, and Edward wasn't marching around looking for a heroic showdown, he was on a chevauchée, a fast, destructive raid meant to damage French territory and force the king to respond. And respond he did. The English army likely numbered around 12,000 men. It wasn't small, but it was outmatched. The French host was probably at least twice that size and included a large body of heavily armored knights along with hired Genoese crossbowmen. On paper, it should have been a straightforward French victory, but battles aren't fought on paper. Edward stopped near the village of Crecy and chose his ground carefully. The English took position on a gentle ridge with woods protecting their flanks and open ground in front of them. It wasn't dramatic terrain, but it forced any attacker to come uphill under observation with little room to maneuver. Then Edward made another important decision. He dismounted his men-at-arms and placed them alongside his infantry. This was not a traditional cavalry army preparing to charge. It was a defensive force designed to hold the ground. And then he waited. The French arrived late in the afternoon after a long march, tired and eager to fight. Contemporary sources mention a rainstorm passing over the field shortly before the battle began. And that detail matters because the French opened the fighting by sending forward the Genoese crossbowmen. Crossbows were powerful weapons, but they were slow to reload and sensitive to weather. The English longbowmen, by contrast, were ready. Their bowstrings could be protected and replaced, and their rate of fire was much higher. When the English archers drew and loosed their arrows, they did so in controlled, repeated volleys. Not individual shots, not heroic marksmanship, just steady, disciplined fire. The Genoese advance faltered almost immediately, and instead of pulling back and reorganizing, French knights behind them lost patience. They charged forward, straight through their own retreating infantry, and that decision proved disastrous. Horses, struck by arrows, panicked or fell. Men collided with one another on the slope. Armor that was meant to protect became a liability when bodies piled up and formations broke apart. And every time the French tried to push forward, English archers loosed again. Wave after wave attacked, and wave after wave collapsed. This went on to the evening. The English line held, the French assault disintegrated, and by nightfall, the battlefield was littered with fallen nobles, knights, and retainers. Among the dead was the King of Bohemia, who, according to chroniclers, rode into battle despite being blind. English losses were comparatively light. Crecy didn't mean that knights were finished, and it didn't mean missile weapons were suddenly unbeatable. What it showed was something far more important. Discipline, preparation, and terrain could outweigh numbers and noble rank. Medieval warfare didn't change overnight. Knights would continue to dominate European battlefields for generations, but Crecy forced commanders to confront a reality they could no longer ignore. Courage alone was no longer enough. Later battles, Poitiers, and eventually Agincourt, would drive the lesson home again. Infantry and missile troops, when used properly, could decide the fate of armies. Crecy wasn't a battle of legend, it was a battle of patience, of planning, of men doing their jobs under pressure. And on that August afternoon in 1346, arrows weren't just loosed into the advancing French lines. They were loosed into the future of warfare itself.